Welcome to a convocation of the UU Multiracial Unity Action Council. Our name and initials is UUMUAC, and it ought to be pronounced UMUAC, but that's hard, and so a lot of us say UMIAC instead. Our topic is white privilege and multiracial unity. White privilege in both good and bad senses. There's something very valid about that concept, but unfortunately it can be weaponized and can cause all kinds of difficulty. The prime speaker is Dr. Ken Christensen, and I'm Richard Trudeau. I'm the chair of UMIAC this year, and I'll be participating also. I have an announcement. Well, first, this is who we are. This is our goal, the unity of the light and dark-skinned people of the world. Our mission is to foster what we call multiracial unity by living the 7 UU principles while keeping an eye on the playbook of Dr. MLK. Here's my announcement. We are the people who also runs third Wednesday worship services, Vesper services in the evenings. And our next one is this coming Wednesday, April 17th. The preacher's Reverend Jack Reich, and his sermon title is The Serious Theological, Organizational, and Ministerial Errors Underlying the UUA's Current Anti-Racism Efforts. If you've ever attended one of these services in the past, you'll automatically get the Zoom link for it on the day before, on Tuesday afternoon, probably, excuse me. But if you have never attended one of these services, if you simply send an email to that address, the name Richard, that's me, the numeral 3, the word point, all run together at Gmail, on Tuesday afternoon, will send you the link. And you can see past services if you go to our website and scroll down to a link for third Wednesday services. I am excited to introduce, we're going to begin our convocation today by playing for you a song, a wonderful song called What You Gonna Do, UU, by Michael Johnson. Michael Johnson is the president of the Open Hearts and Minds Fellowship in Austin. He's a member of the board of directors of UMIAC, and he's a member of the North American Unitarian Association. And I'm going to have to stop sharing for a minute in order to adjust the sound, and also, of course, in order to find the MP3. But I'm going to put the lyrics on the screen while he's singing.
Tell me what you gonna do when the church you love becomes dogmatic and it abolishes the principles for which it always stood. Tell me what you gonna do when they tell you to keep your mouth shut and then they punish those who refuse to get in line. Will you try to reason? Will you try to fight? Will you stay cause you sing in the choir? Will you go along to get along? Will you meet with your friends to conspire? Is there a light down the road that leads towards home? Or are we just facing the end? Oh, what will you use to? Tell me what you gonna do when you find out that Woody Guthrie's songs can't be sung here no more. And when they tell you that everybody's supposed to think the same. Tell me what you gonna do when they tell you that they love you, and that's the reason you've been canceled and publicly put to shame. Will you try to reason? Will you try to fight? Will you stay 'cause you sing in the choir? Will you go along to get along? Will you meet with your friends to conspire? Is there a light down the road that leads towards home, or are we just facing the end? What will you do? Tell me what you gonna do when the pulpit isn't really free no more, and the letters to the editor, they're all gone. Tell me what you gonna do when they attack your character and the enlightenment grows darker and darker day by day. Does it stand to reason to stand and fight and then to say what you think to the choir? Or do you go along to get along and meet with your friends to conspire? Is there a light down the road that leads back home, or are we just wasting our time? Tell me, what will you do? Tell me what you gonna do, all of you dear you. Sisters and brothers, what the hell are we gonna do?
If you like that, in a day or two, I will ask Alan Lindrup. He's the person who sent you the Zoom link for this conference. I'm going to send him the MP3 file and the lyrics, and ask him to, by email, share it with everyone who registered for this conference. And I hope you share it widely. I think this could become viral among us resistors. I think it really speaks to me, and I think it speaks to a lot of people. I'm the first speaker here of our convocation. I want to talk about the term white supremacy. The term was first popularized by a woman named Peggy McIntosh, a white woman now in her 80s, I think, who came from privilege herself, from a very prosperous family, a family with access to power. She was sent to all the best schools. She worked at what was originally called the Center for Research on Women at Wellesley College. Wellesley College is a private women's college in a posh suburb of Boston called Wellesley. Hillary Clinton graduated from Wellesley College. Our former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, went to Wellesley College, and so on. Peggy was studying women's undeserved disadvantages. And let me just cite one. Younger people find this incredible. Most of us are not younger. You won't find this incredible. In the early 70s, and before that, until the early 70s, banks frequently denied credit cards to single women who were unmarried or divorced or widowed, unless they had a man co-sign. That's an example of something that Peggy McIntosh would call an undeserved disadvantage that women had. And that was illegal. That policy was illegal by a federal law in 1974. It was Peggy McIntosh noticed, and she found this very interesting, that men freely acknowledged the existence of these undeserved disadvantages that women had, but simultaneously, men were not ready to acknowledge that they had corresponding unearned privileges, corresponding to every undeserved disadvantage that women had. There was a corresponding unearned advantage that men had. In this case, it was very easy for a single man to get a credit card. And she called these unearned advantages that men had, she called them male privilege. So that's when she started using the word privilege. It was originally male privilege. And then, as a very socially conscious person, a person whom I respect, Peggy McIntosh one day, looking around at her office at Wellesley College, looking at the African American women and men working there, she thought, oh, if men seem to be unaware of their unearned advantages, their male privilege, I'll bet there's a racial counterpart. I certainly, as a white woman, I'm certainly aware of the undeserved disadvantages that Black and brown people have. Well, corresponding to each of those, there's an unearned advantage that I as a white person have, but I tend not to be aware of them. And she was interested in the whole issue because she felt for social progress, it's important that everybody understand everything that's going on. And it was important, just as it was important for men to become aware of male privilege, she felt, well, we whites need to become aware of white privileges. And in a paper, it was originally 1988, but the most popular version comes from 1989, she listed a number of white privileges. And I'll read you just 3 or 4 here. I can go into a hairdresser's shop and find someone who knows how to cut my hair. And that wasn't, well, the African American women who worked with her, they didn't live in Wellesley. But if they had lived in Wellesley, they would have found it impossible to find someone who knew how to cut African American hair. That's an unearned advantage that she has. And notice, she's not condemning this. Of course, there are no salons catering to African American women in Wellesley, or there weren't then, because there were virtually no African American women in Wellesley, and such a salon would go out of business. She wasn't saying that this made you racist. She was just saying this is a fact. This was a fact, and it's something that white people need to be aware of. Here's a couple of other things that she mentioned. I can remain oblivious to the slang and the customs of people of color without feeling, in my culture, any penalty or disapproval for being unaware. If a traffic cop pulls me over, or the IRS audits my tax return, I can be sure I haven't been singled out because of my race. I can take a job with an affirmative action employer without having coworkers on the job suspect that I got it because of my race. And finally, and this is the most comprehensive, I think, of all of them, if my day is going badly, or my week is going badly, or my year is going badly, or my life is going badly, I don't have to ask of each negative event or situation whether it was caused by racial prejudice. I don't have to worry about that. She, years later, when the concept of white privilege had been weaponized by people like Robin DiAngelo and the national UU officials, she wrote a supplementary paper This is from 2010, in which she said, "My work is not about blame or shame or guilt, or whether one is a nice person or a racist. It's about observing, realizing, thinking systematically. It's about seeing privilege, which is just the upside of oppression and discrimination. It's about unearned advantage, which can also be described as exemption from discrimination. Please do not generalize from my papers," she said. "They're about my experience, not about the experience of all white people in all times and places and circumstances." But of course, as I said before, many people, including many of the people in UU circles who have been captured by the neo-racist ideology, which has captured so many of our leaders, many of them are not abiding by that and are using the term white privilege in a weaponized way. But she just felt it's important to become aware of it. It's just important for everyone to be aware of all the facts. And now I turn it over to Dr. Ken Christensen.
I'd like to say, I'll take question. Richard, turn on the sound.
Oh my God, I forgot to turn off the, I had the sound on. So
yeah, it worked for you, but when I started talking, it played it back. Yeah.
were you folks able to hear what I was just saying? It
Yes.
must have been distorted. Must have been distorted though. Okay.
It worked fine for you, but somebody else coming through would get the reverberation.
Yeah, sorry.
I see a hand. We could put hands. I think we could save questions for later, but put them in the chat box if you like. But to in general have a discussion later is what we were thinking.
We're definitely.
I did put a link to the two articles by Peggy McIntosh that he referred to into the chat box. I will say thank you all for coming this afternoon. I trust we'll have a lively discussion after the presentations. I really appreciated working with Richard. He is very calm and steady, while I tend to be a little bit more ADHD. He's very calming influence. When Peggy McIntosh's article on white privilege started circulating in the late 1980s, I was teaching a culture diversity course every semester at a small private college in Northwest Ohio. Reading her list of privileges, many seemed like class privileges as much as or more than race privileges, but it made for very good class discussion. I didn't think about white privilege outside of this educational context very much at all until I joined the UUA at the First Unitarian Church of Chicago in 2009. That was Finley Campbell's church. Finley brought me into the racial justice task force of the church and into the early meetings where UMIAC was born. At that time, the Unitarian Universalist Association maintained email lists for various interest groups. There was a list for people interested in anti-racism. What is surprising now in terms of what came later, the discussion was integrated. I remember a very painful exchange where a white participant discussed his father's very hard life. The response from several of the African-American participants was that he was still better off than they were because he had white privilege. White privilege was used as an excuse to deny empathy. I heard a similar attitude expressed when I was invited to join a Beloved Conversations anti-racism program at my former Unitarian Universalist congregation. It was made extremely clear that white people's problems would not be a subject of the conversation. The ultimate empathy block might be the message that all white people are oppressors and all Black people are victims. I expect most of you or many of you have heard that. In this statement, it's assumed that oppressors have all the privileges and don't deserve any empathy. Only victims get empathy. Recently, Bruce Knotts told me a powerful story that goes in the other direction. Bruce hosted Reverend William Barber at the United Nations. What really struck Bruce was how Reverend Barber reacted when Bruce introduced him to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Prince Zayed of Jordan. High Commissioner Jordan said, "We've really got to do something for Black people." He said it several times. "We've really got to do something for Black people." Every time he said it, Reverend Barber responded, "No, all poor people. No, all poor people." Empathy flows freely here. Guilt is another powerful human emotion. Guilt can be very real when you've done something wrong and need to make it right. Been there, done that. Or it can be neurotic when you feel intense guilt for things you can't control or haven't done. The way guilt has been used in relation to white privilege falls much more into the latter category than the former. In Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, published by UUA-owned Beacon Press in 2018, white privilege means all the unearned and undeserved advantages white people receive by participation in white supremacy culture. The term white fragility, in turn, refers to the self-protecting squirming and defensiveness white people demonstrate when pressured to confess that they are part of a racist culture from which they benefit greatly and are thereby racist. This is white privilege on steroids. In DiAngelo's argument, white privilege causes white people to become emotionally disabled. She's right. This is guilt-based anti-racism. Real social change work is greatly diminished, both by the emotional paralysis created by guilt and shame, and by the energy wasted trying to force white people to own up to being racist. I'm going to sound preachy for a moment. I've given my personal answer to this dilemma of collective guilt and shame in several other presentations. My answer is, drumroll please, when confronted by a history of horrible things done by members of your race, your gender, your religion, your nation, don't feel shame or guilt. Get angry instead. Let your anger at injustice motivate you to work with others from any background to change things that need changing. Treat each other as equals. Put all the vision, talent, and energy you have into it, not giving up when it takes a long time to achieve results. Keep the communication lines with your collaborators as healthy as possible. That's the best hope for positive change. Privilege and class have a close relationship. How do class issues stack up in the Black community and in the white community? Are they similar or are they different? That's a really good question I want to look at. First, I want to share a view of the Black community written by a prominent Black author. Eugene Robinson is a reporter for the Washington Post and a frequent commentator on MSNBC. He wrote the book Disintegration in 2010 to describe Black America as he experienced it. I'll share my screen here in a moment to show the beginning of what he said. Get this going here now. I want to see, where is it best? I'm going to go out again and back. I don't see what I want to see yet. I'm going to make sure I share this right.
Mhm.
Okay, I have to share it not the best way because something else is going wrong. Okay. Can you see the statements by, okay, what he said, instead of one America, there are now four. A mainstream middle-class majority with full ownership stake in American society, a large abandoned minority with less hope of escaping poverty and dysfunction that at any time since Reconstruction's crushing end, a small transcendent elite with enormous wealth, power, and influence that even white folks have to genuflect, and two newly emergent groups, individuals of mixed race heritage and communities of recent Black immigrants that make us wonder what Black is even supposed to mean. And he goes on to write in the book, these four Black Americas are increasingly distinct, separated by demography, geography, and psychology. They have different profiles, different mindsets, different hopes, fears, and dreams. There are times and places where we all still come back together on the increasingly rare occasions when we feel lumped together, defined and threatened solely on the basis of skin color, usually involving some high-profile instance of bald-faced discrimination or injustice, and in venues like urban or Black-oriented radio, which serves as a kind of speed of light grapevine. More and more, however, we lead separate lives. The book includes lengthy chapters describing each of these groups with many stories. It's very readable. I'll put a link in the chat box. I can't do that, I don't think, until I stop.
Matt Shear has just done it.
Oh, he put it in there. Okay, good. Exploring the links between class and privilege require us to taking a look at social and economic class overall, Black and white. I like to talk about class in terms of pictures rather than statistics. And for that reason, I'm going to share a few more slides. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I'm not sure at all who else thinks about it the way I do. The basic slide you see here, three classes that are generally talked about, and you could argue there are many subclasses within the classes. The basic needs met is a line between lower class and middle class for me, and that's of course a slippery line. What are basic needs? What's basic? What's not? Some things are definitely basic, like housing and food and basic security from being killed and destroyed. At the next line up between middle class and upper class, to me, the line is, do you have to work to live well? I will briefly just add here that I've been retired now for 16 years. I was counting that up, and my wife and I both have retirement incomes, which were in the old plan where they were somewhat more adequate, I think, than some of the later plans. So we're living comfortably without working, which puts us at the very bottom of the upper class. We'll talk a lot more about the upper class a little bit later. But I want to deal with this class structure. Wrong way. But the basic needs, the bottom, the lowest class. Meditate on this a moment. The very bottom, homeless, no food, no money, no social acceptance, desperation. It's real for some people. Jacksonville, Florida has a large part of town that a lot of people live in this lower class area here and working at various things to deal with that. Question of, do you have family support? Who can you rely on? Inadequate clothing, streets, schools. Transportation is a big thing. If you can't get places where you need to go, you live in a food desert, what do you do? And no credit is a big thing. That's no regular credit. There are people out there, hucksters, who will give credit to anybody at very high interest rates and take physical measures, if needed, to get what they want back and make a lot of money off the poor. Middle class, varying needs of security. Middle class means that you're able to meet your basic needs and begin to save, begin to build equity in a home, adequate health and nutrition, typically a safer neighborhood, able to get loans, able to get credit. And it's a big deal to have a car that runs for sure versus maybe a car you can pick up for very low cost that is not reliable and you can't get to work. Can get mortgages, take vacations. In middle classes where you begin to have discretionary time for political participation. But you still need to work in the middle class. You aren't quite past the point where you can retire, put it that way. Upper class, just a few things to say here and a little bit more later. At the bottom, sufficient income to live reasonably well without working. I think when we envision the upper class, we envision yachts and multiple houses and many vacations and such like that. Well, that can be true. We'll get to a little bit more of that a little bit later. But a big thing is in the upper class, you can take risks without fear of destitution. You can take risks without worrying, risk with jobs, risk with investments without worrying that you're going to be back down at the bottom, homeless, no food, no money, and so forth, if things don't work out. And a big thing here is that extreme wealth does bring increasing political and economic power, but also the character of people in the upper class can vary greatly. People in the upper class can be altruistic. Many things in history have been supported by people in the upper class and have gone through that. I think of William Wilberforce in relation to slavery. Think of a lot of people who use their wealth and their power for good ends. And of course, we know a lot of people do not use their wealth and power for good ends. And that's true in both in the Black and in the white community. I want to say more specifically about the Black community for a moment, particularly in regards to the lowest class, starting up there, the abandoned group that Eugene Robinson talks about. The people in the lowest class in the Black community are not the ones saying only powerless people can know the truth. They are not the ones who call white people paternalistic if they devise ways to help the Black community. They are not the ones that disparage working as equals across racial lines to change discriminatory laws and practices. They are not the ones closely tracking white microaggressions. They are not the ones denying empathy to white people in need. They are not the ones that minimize the importance of pursuing social justice goals in areas other than race, for instance, international relations, climate change, and things like that. Members of all classes are searching for security, white and Black. And there are, as Eugene Robinson pointed out, people Black people in all these areas, even as there are white people in all these areas. People who want to dominate others utilize fear, guilt, and jealousy to get their way. I think middle-class people are most susceptible to this kind of manipulation, in part because they know what security they have could be lost. People higher in the class structure have less to fear from doing or saying the wrong thing. People lowest in the class structure just do what they can do to survive. Before turning the podium over to Richard again, I want to say one brief thing about social class in relation to the Unitarian Universalist Association. There has been what's called an elite capture of the anti-racist movement. on the part of Black nationalist-oriented middle-class Black people aligned with middle-class guilt-driven white people in the UUA. What elite capture means is that people who are not in the lower class, not in the abandoned group, claim to speak for the lower class, even though their real orientation is very different. This approach is a tool for dominance rather than a tool for constructive change. Richard has a story to tell you. Richard?
Stop sharing.
Yeah, I got to stop sharing. It's right.
This is a story I've told before, but to me it makes obvious the silliness of what a lot of UU national officials say. It's about people that two people that I don't know personally, but I know of. And this is a story that I learned about a few years ago. I'll speak about it as if it's in the present tense, but this is really a few years in the past. Two people, Ann and Bob. Ann and Bob. Ann was a Black lesbian in her early 30s. Bob was a straight white man in his mid-50s who recently became acquainted. So let me tell you a little bit about them. Bob was the fourth son of an Alabama sharecropper who did terribly in school and dropped out of school as soon as he could and went to work in a city a little to the north of where his folks were farming. And he kept the job for, I don't know, a year and a half until he got either laid off or bored or maybe fired. But this is a pattern that he then followed for most of the next 30 years. When he'd leave a job for whatever reason, he'd move to another city further north and get a new job and keep it for just a while and then move to another city further north. And by the time he was in his mid-40s, after 30 years, he was in Boston. And once he got to Boston, the Boston area, he stayed because he met a woman, a Puerto Rican woman, who had two teenage sons, and he fell in love with her and they married. So he's settled now in the Boston area, though he does still keep changing jobs. I think he drives forklifts. He can, when he gets tired of employment at some warehouse, he can always find employment elsewhere at a warehouse or a dock or something. He drives forklifts. I believe that's what he does. Anyway, it's now Bob is in his mid-50s. His wife's teenage sons are now in their 20s. One has just gotten married. The other seems not far behind. And his wife is getting after him because Bob is functionally illiterate. And his wife tells him, "You're the only grandfather my grandchildren are ever going to know. And I think it's a crying shame that their grandfather is not going to be able to read to them." And he acknowledges the validity of what she's saying. And he's, of course, been ashamed, for years of not really being able to read. I mean, he could read a bus schedule, but that was about it. So he started going to a literacy project. And that's where he met Ann. That's where he met Ann. Ann is his teacher. Ann, the early 30s Black lesbian, grew up in a Boston suburb, middle-class family. Her father was an attorney. Her mother was the vice principal of an elementary school. She herself went to good school. She got a PhD. Now she's a professor at one of the Boston area colleges, I think of sociology, if I remember right. And she volunteers one night a week at this literacy project. And that's how Ann and Bob met. And Bob was a little leery of her at first, not because she was a woman, not because she was Black. He had come to know and respect a number of Black people over the years. It was, I think, because she was a lesbian. There was something a little odd about her. And then one day in class, one week, she alluded to the fact that she was married to a Puerto Rican woman. And that just broke the ice. Ann and Bob both have Puerto Rican wives. and after class, not that they have not, you know, become people who socialize extensively with each other, but they will after class or even before class exchange stories about Puerto Rican women and what it's like being married to a Puerto Rican woman and so on. And they respect each other. But the UU national officials would say, oh, Anne is triply oppressed. First, because she's a woman. Secondly, because she's a lesbian. And most of all, because she's Black. She's triply oppressed. And Bob is an oppressor 3 times because he's white. He has that advantage. And because he's male, he has that advantage. And because he's straight. And of course, see, the ideology of the national UU officials isn't concerned with individuals at all. That's why they're interested in eroding the first principle. The first principle is about individuals. Their ideology doesn't think about individuals, but about large groups of people. This is the problem. But stories like Ann and Bob just show how, in my opinion, how ridiculous that is. And now back to Ken.
I'm going to share another screen here. This is a chart. Actually, I saw it first at 2020 GA. There was a sociologist talking about social class, and he had this chart, and I subsequently went to the website and downloaded it. I've checked. The website does not have an update, so this is the latest one they have. However, it's still quite telling. I doubt that things have gotten better. It talks about wealth distribution in the US, perception versus reality. And here we're talking about the upper class. The argument has been made since, well, the early 1990s that we live in a white supremacy culture, yet we have Black people who often do the supreme things too. Think Senator Tim Scott, think Clarence Thomas, think the people who feel very much aligned with the political party that's least likely to help the poor. Put it that way. The wealth distribution here, the bottom line is what it really was in 2016, and again I suspect it's gotten worse, where the top 1% own 39% of the wealth in the nation, and the top 20% own 90% of the wealth in the nation. And where would I be on this chart? If you look to the far right and maybe move 0.5 millimeter to the left, I might be right there in the middle. And the 2 lower parts, what they're saying here is that the 2 lowest fifths of the American population have no wealth, which means no savings or debts far higher than what savings and so forth. And so the beginning of the middle is really the beginning of the upper class, beginning of people who maybe don't have to work every day to live. The point I want to make with this is there are so many reasons to think of our culture as a wealth supremacy culture rather than a white supremacy culture. Historically, there were many correspondences, but that's less and less true. And also a big thing, even historically, the thing wealthy did, what was it, 8,000 owners of large plantations in the South controlling millions of Black people. And part of the way they controlled them was by splitting white and Black. There were slave rebellions where white and Black got together. There were other times when the whites who were being exploited by the wealthy folks, which is very much part of reality, and the Blacks being exploited by wealthy folks. When they get together, the wealthy folks are in trouble. So one of the biggest tools that wealth has used is divide and conquer, and divide and conquer works. I think we see divide and conquer having worked in the Unitarian Universalist Association between 1965 and 1969. In 1965, when Dr. King called Homer Jack and many UUs showed up in Selma and were part of the many white people who were participating in the civil rights movement up to 1968 and 69, where the UUA basically engaged in anti-racism from that point on a segregated basis. We'll talk about that more in other papers and other times and question and answer. Anyway, saying all this, I want to say that this wealth supremacy culture or white supremacy culture question, so much was based on Tima Okun's paper from pretty far back. And there is a very interesting, I'm just putting it in the chat room right now, I just did. There is a very interesting interview she did in 2018, where she gives her feelings about the misuse of that. The link I put there has both the interview and the text. And I read the text some time ago, and I just listened to the interview last week. And I want to say the interview carries much more meaning than the text, because you hear her own words, her own hesitancy a little bit, her own how she expresses herself. And to listen to that gives a great deal of insight into what is going on with the idea of, with the misuses of her thoughts about white supremacy culture. I will say that I was exposed to the misuses in depth, and you probably have been too. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Richard.
I want to show pieces of a video. I want to talk about something called the Timothy Smith Network, which is something in Boston. To me, it's an example of what a powerful tool privilege is. This is the plus side of privilege, not necessarily white privilege, but just privilege. This is Timothy Smith. Boy, there's a privileged-looking white guy. Yeah, he's a Mayflower descendant. He's a New England Yankee. He married a woman who also was from a prosperous family. He ran what was called then a dry goods store, kind of a department store in the part of Boston called Roxbury. And Roxbury was originally a separate town and became part of the city of Boston. And there was a kind of tragedy in his life. He and his wife had 7 or 8 children. None of them lived to adulthood. A few died within a few weeks of birth. A few died at ages like 1 and 2. One made it to, I think, 11 and then was carried off by some childhood disease. This may be part of why when he and his wife died, they died incidentally on the same day, and it was Easter Sunday in 1918. They donated all of their wealth to charity, to many different charities, but a big piece of it they donated to the citizens of Roxbury. And I think Timothy Smith may have gotten this idea because of something Benjamin Franklin did. Benjamin Franklin died in 1790 and left money in trust for the citizens of Boston and Philadelphia. Boston, where he had been born, Philadelphia, where he had lived in as an adult. But the money was held in trust for 100 years and then would be released. And of course, then it was a huge pile of money. And there are institutions in Boston today and in Philadelphia today that were founded and funded by that money that still exists. This all happened in 1890 when Franklin's will was put into effect. And Timothy Smith, therefore, it was big news at the time in 1890. And Timothy Smith was a middle-aged man then, and he was impressed by that. So he did the same thing. The big pile of money not donated to charities, Smith and his wife donated to the citizens of Roxbury on the condition that it be held in trust for 100 years. Now, unfortunately, the Internal Revenue Service started sniffing around and trying to get access to that money, and the city of Boston got afraid that they were going to succeed. So the city of Boston broke his will after only 78 years and got the money. But they're honoring his will in they're devoting it to the benefit of the citizens of Roxbury. That's Roxbury. That outline is the part of Boston that used to be the town of Roxbury. And when the Smith money finally became available in the late 90s, privileged people, people in government, but especially people with computer skills, these were Black and brown and white people who had computer skills that they had mostly acquired in corporate settings. These were often retired people or people approaching retirement age, people who hadn't learned computer skills in colleges but had acquired them on the job. There was a lot of talk about the digital divide at this time. Roxbury, at the time of Timothy Smith's death, Roxbury was a city of immigrants, or an area of immigrants, Irish mostly and Jewish. But now, of course, it's an area of mostly Black and brown people. And people in the late 90s said, how can we best serve the citizens of Roxbury? We can help teach them computer skills. Roxbury has a lot of people who are really have-nots, who don't have computers, who don't have computer skills, have no easy way of getting computer skills, and they're being left further and further behind. And we, in our corporate lives, are aware of how important computers are and will become. And so they identified these 27 different organizations in Roxbury. Some of them were branches of the Boston Public School System. A couple of them were branches of the Boston Public Library. The others were social service agencies that were private, had no relation to the city or to each other. Agencies with different histories, different missions. For example, one was a health clinic, one was a daycare center, one was called the Veterans Benefits Clearinghouse. It helped veterans get through the VA bureaucracy to access their benefits. One was a settlement house for immigrants. One was a local access TV station. These were approached, and they said, the organizers, who are now calling themselves the Timothy Smith Network, honoring the man who provided the money, they said, if you provide space in your building, space that will be available to the general public whenever your building is open, we will put in that space chairs and desks and computers. And every 2 or 3 years, we will replace the computers with new computers. And we will provide classes. We will provide teachers and trainers to teach people the most basic computer skills, and then some very fairly advanced computer skills too. And in the rest of this video I want to show you, you'll hear testimony from 3 or 4, I think, people who represent individual agencies. The first is the principal of a Boston public school, and she's going to talk about autistic children in her school and how they're benefited.
The Higginson Lewis K-8 school is proud to be one of the many Boston public schools that has received a generous donation from the Timothy Smith Network. And that allowed us to provide technology access to the children in our autism stream. Many of those students are nonverbal, and having access to technology has helped them in their families to improve in the area of oral communication. And it certainly raised the achievement level of all of our students.
All of our programs affected my life in several different ways. It was a 12-week program that really touched on all keys of Microsoft Office, how to rewrite your resume, how to write a proper cover letter, and so forth. I apply those skills at my current position, creating my own spreadsheets, writing proper emails. So it opened up a lot of doors for me, where I thought I was sort of like at the end of my road of learning. Now this just showed me that I can still jump into that and still advance in my career.
I had been laid off from my position as a after-school program director, and I came across an advertisement for the OLLR program in a community newspaper. So I enrolled, took the classes. As a result of successfully completing the program, I was able to do an internship at United South and Settlements. And as a result of that, I was able to obtain full-time employment here at United South and Settlements.
We have been able to design a bunch of computer training programs specifically geared to the needs of our senior population. What we've heard from our seniors is the growing alienation between them and their grandchildren who do most of their communicating online. And so by bringing seniors into the computer lab, teaching them how to work the computers, they lose that fear of technology. And this has enabled them to stay in contact with their children and their grandchildren, no matter where they may live in the US. Programs like this really help them get the most out of how they can use technology to improve their quality of life.
I'm a retired Boston police officer who was introduced through a friend to the Timothy Smith Network in Boston neighborhood network. As a result of the training that I received here, I'm no longer retired and no longer have to ask, what am I going to do from day to day? And needless to say, I'm deeply appreciative to Timothy Smith and the Timothy Smith Network.
Two people have sent me urgent things saying I should have changed the sound setting to music. Were you able to hear what people were saying?
Yeah, they were okay.
Yeah, I got your text and I got your chat messages, but I couldn't do it. I don't have access to the button when
Oh,
or
yeah.
I don't know how to have access. Let's put it that way. I don't know how to access the sound button. But anyway, to me, the significance of this is, my goodness, what privilege can do to accomplish good. And the privileged people involved in this were, yes, some of them were white, but a great many, the majority were black and brown, privileged people with computer skills who helped set this up. Back to Ken.
Yeah, Ken will be very short. We're back. We're close to the end of an hour here now. And I have written a lot of my own thoughts about what to do about these things on my website at assetbasedantiracism.com. I will put that into the chat room. I didn't have it ready to go, but so I'm not going to say a whole lot more now, but I really appreciate working with Richard, who is an equal partner in presentations. I hope you noticed that, even though he gave me more credit earlier. I really appreciate Richard. I'll say that again. And I think we're ready for your questions. So use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen when you want to ask a question or make a comment. First, Alan.
Hi there. So yeah, I was kind of thinking about privilege when we had this topic coming up. And so I put together a little list of 6 privileges, because I consider myself to be a privileged person. One of them does relate to race, but others relate to other things. So I want to kind of run through these. First of all, I think my utmost privilege was being born in a democratic, economically developed country. This gives us great opportunities and so forth. And, whatever the class is of a person in the United States, most of the time a person is going to be in a better position than a lot of people in poor countries in the world or autocratic countries. So just the fortune of being born in a country like the United States or, Germany, Canada, Norway, where my dad was born, whatever, etc., is a great advantage. So that's the first of all. Second, I would say having loving parents. I had 2 loving parents that were very supportive. One of them died when I was 9, but the other one, my mom, was able to, provide all I needed in the way of parental support and everything. That's a great thing. Not everybody has that. Some parents have various problems of their own and can't really provide that to their kids, or they're working so much that they, fall down a little bit in that capacity. So that was my second privilege. Third, I would say was I had my parents, but particularly my mom, encouraged me to, get a good education, probably go to college, get skills so you could, have a good job and a job that you felt was meaningful. And also kind of showed me she was a librarian and, one of those people who went through the Depression and so forth and had a value in government employment as a stable, we could do a meaningful job, have a stable work situation. You don't fear as much being tossed out by ups and downs of the economy, and have decent benefits and a decent retirement plan. And so, I ended up having a 35-year career with the U.S. Social Security Administration, and I think that was a great decision on my part to go that way. And I kind of thank my mom particularly for that guidance because it did provide me with a meaningful career, one where I had decent benefits while I was working, and then a very nice retirement package. Now, so that's my third one. The fourth one, it kind of relates to that. You're talking about going to getting a good education. I was born at a time where one could go to a state university at a very modest cost. I went to the University of Illinois at Chicago. My mom was a librarian. I couldn't afford to go away to a college or anything like that. I had to be able to be a commuter student, but I was able to do that on a very modest amount of income, and I didn't go into debt. Somebody born a generation later or two generations later, you would have ended up probably with a lot of college debt or student debt. So that's a fourth advantage I think I found. Fifth one, I would say does relate to race. At the time I came out of college, which entered the workforce in 1970, being a white guy and a white male, I didn't face discrimination. And so I did have white privilege in that sense. Now, a lot of that is, since dissolved and it's much more egalitarian, but I was advantaged. I didn't have a problem, facing any discrimination at the time I entered the workforce. And then sixth, I would say I have fairly good genes, which has meant I've been a fairly healthy person through my years. When I retired, I had over 14 months of unused sick leave because I very rarely got sick. And I had a mother and grandmother who both lived to about 95. So hopefully I will live to that kind of age. And so, the advantage of having good genes is another advantage that I've always considered. So all of these are my privileges. There's probably more, but these are six that popped into my head. So yes, I'm a privileged person. And then just like the story that Richard shows, I tend to give about 20% of my income away to charity, charitable contributions each year. And that's part of my giving back because I feel that, if you've been blessed with the opportunity, then you need to give back. So enough said.
Matthew.
Thanks. First of all, I want to thank you, Ken, and Richard for a wonderful presentation. Definitely will want to share the video with people who didn't make it here today. So much good information. I would just add a definition of privilege that I use is the ability to walk away. And that's all. Thanks.
I like that. If things are really bad, you're not stuck there. You can walk away. Yeah, you have options. Yeah. Yeah.
Other questions or comments? Patricia.
Hi, I have a question for you, Ken. I've read a lot about your asset-based anti-racism. What do you think about Coleman Hughes and all of these things that have just come out in the last few weeks that they're going back and calling colorblind anti-racism?
Mixed.
Mixed.
Overall, what?
Mixed. What do you mean?
Yeah, I'll say more. I've started reading Coleman Hughes. I've not finished. He's got some good points, but he's also very young. In putting down the affirmative action, for instance, the largest beneficiary of the affirmative action programs in the 1970s were white women. Blacks also benefited, but in the original affirmative action programs, you had to be qualified to be hired. There were not quotas that said you had to hire so many people whether they were qualified or not, even though the right wing said there was. There really wasn't. And I lived in a town where there was a very large General Motors foundry and in Northwest Ohio, and there were a lot of tomato fields in the area and a lot of migrants picking tomatoes, and a lot of migrants settled out when the foundry expanded, and men got jobs, and some of the women went to get jobs too. Latino women went to get jobs. And one of them in particular, I remember, had a story that she'd asked for a job and they told her no. About 8 or 10 years later, after affirmative action came out, she got a call and said, we kept your application in a drawer here, and we see that you look like you're qualified. Can you come in? She got a really good job. But the kind of automatic discount of white and black in that regard, I kind of get where Coleman's coming from, but I think he's limited by his age and experience.
He is a conservative.
And he is just 28.
Yes. A 28-year-old conservative. Yeah.
Well, I have questions. John McWhorter and others make a lot of good points. John McWhorter comes out of a class structure, out of an upper class structure. And I know he said, police are great in New York City. They're great. Maybe, maybe not. Well, it's what's your experience? And so a person's skin color does not designate how authoritative their thoughts are. They still need to do research. They still need to think. They still need to look a little further sometimes, I think. Dick.
Yeah, I've thought about this privilege thing for decades too. And I realized, well, growing up, middle class, I had some of the middle class privileges, like Alan pointed out and Richard has pointed out. But growing up Unitarian, in a sort of a home that was focused on justice, including racial and economic justice, I quickly decided, well, I'm getting a good education and I'll have a decent job. I won't have wealth, but at least I'll be okay. What's this privilege thing mean to me? And I quickly came to the conclusion, even as a teenager, that with privilege comes responsibility. And then I could say, well, there's nothing wrong with privilege. I could say, there are many wealthy people or even non-wealthy people who do a lot of good because they feel that responsibility, that they're able to do something because they're not living in poverty. And that's a privilege. And we're living in a first world country. We've traveled overseas. And so I know we're living in the belly of the beast, so to speak. But that's a privilege that we can take advantage of to make a better world. So that's my point of view.
I appreciate that. Are we out of questions and comments? Oh no, Ellen.
Yeah, I thought this was a very interesting presentation. I really appreciate it. And one thing that surprised me was when Richard was telling about the origin of the concept, and that it wasn't meant as a weapon, which it has turned out to be, in my opinion. I've thought about, once they started talking about it, white privilege and, that you have to come to grips with it and announce it and all that. I thought about it quite a bit. And it turns out I had been thinking about similar things, but not calling it that previously. I think that they have changed. It used to be that there was something that certain groups did not have. That was the problem. And so the idea was to fight so that everybody, that they would have those, so that everybody would have the same privileges. And now it's been turned around so that certain groups have privileges which they didn't earn, and they can't get rid of it, and they're somehow tainted by it, and that's so it has been turned into a weapon, and so that I think is wrong. Myself, I think basically whatever privilege I have for being white, they should be spread around to everybody. I mean, that's kind of, it's like, that's, to me, that's obvious. But like, I will also say that unearned privileges are very painful, or they can be, depending on your psychological makeup and your political point of view. Myself, it's always been very important to me that things should be fair. That I was just raised that way, and that's actually a privilege, I guess, to be raised to have that kind of a attitude. But what I will tell you, when I was in the Peace Corps in Ghana, and I was like early 20s, like 21, 22, 23. And in certain gatherings or situations, I would be put into the position of honor that would, in my opinion, would be normally accorded to, say, an elder or somebody that had done something special. And to me, that was like torture, that to be placed in that situation where I would be honored for something that I had not done and did not deserve, in my opinion. And that, it was very, very, it made me miserable. So, it's like, what privilege, it kind of, it's not necessarily a privilege if you despise it. So, it's more complicated than just like some people are better off than others.
Yeah, right.
So that's basically, I mean, it's just an observation. It's not, I mean, it's not like the world is terrible because of all this, but it's like, it's complicated. So that's what I have to say.
I see three people with hands: Tessie, Marie, and then Kent. Tessie?
I guess I'm listening to this, and it's been a wonderful, thank you so very much for sharing your thoughts and your feelings. I'm thinking more in terms of, so what? I acknowledge that there is groups of folks that tend to have more privilege than others. But I think white privilege or any other kind of privilege is it has to be in context. And so, for example, I emigrated from Cuba years ago, and as a political refugee, I had the privilege of government helping me find housing and food and et cetera, more so than other people who were poor, who were Americans born and raised in the United States that did not have the same privilege I had at that time. So you put it in context again. If I go down to Miami, my privilege getting into a Cuban restaurant is going to probably be better than yours, unless you're also Latina and also a Cuban because you're one of our tribe. So there is a sense of tribalism there. So what means to me is I acknowledge it. That is the reality that is. But I don't have to live by somebody else's language, somebody else's meaning, and somebody else's decision to feel guilty for having been given something that your tribe has allowed you to have as opposed to other tribes. But what I can do is to then make darn sure that under UU principles, every single person is treated with the same dignity, and that we continue to hold hands together to make sure that everybody has a seat at the table and that everybody's voice is heard, and that privilege that at that point is extended widely and deeply across all kinds of tribes. Thank you.
Marie.
One of the things that I have always been concerned about is the whole idea of how affirmative action was turned on its head. And the reason why I say that, because we have to acknowledge that there were inequalities. And the whole idea of affirmative action is how do you address these inequalities? And I thought it was a good idea. But what bothered me is that, you know, the Blacks, who I would call neo-racism, were the people who were fighting against it. And then I would hear even young people in college who would say that they don't want the stigma of affirmative action because people think that they didn't have the educational qualifications that they got in because they were Black. And as was said before, affirmative action didn't allow you to get in because you were Black. Because in a lot of cases, when some Black people applied and they didn't meet the standards, they had to take what was called, what was it called? They had to take classes to come up to the certain standard in order for them to be able to enroll in particular college. But what was actually done, and as I said, it was done by who I call neo-racism, some of the Black people who fought so much against affirmative action. And of course, there were, what has happened with that whole idea is, of course, women were able to address it. But the other things that they were, because there was no one that was really fighting hard, in my opinion, it was no one that was fighting hard for the true idea of affirmative action, that companies were able, you know, when they were supposed to have a certain class of people there, what they would do, they would have, you know, different ethnic groups, what they call marginalized. In fact, I remember when I was working at this company that that used to do medical coding, and I worked there for 2 years. I wasn't certified. And when the position opened up and I applied, they told me that they couldn't give me the job, although I had been doing it all along, because I wasn't certified. But who they brought in an Indian woman. And that fit the minority. So, I mean, as I said, what was happening, I just think the whole idea, the idea of affirmative action was a good idea, and it was allowed to be watered and used as weapons and other things of that sort.
Okay. Kent.
Well, we're not living in 1970 anymore, actually. Speaking of John McWhorter, just a brief story. He was talking about he was at a linguistic conference, and there was a speaker there, a young Black woman, new in her career, and she had just published her first paper, and she was late to the event, and on, but she enters the room just a novice scholar, and I don't know anything about the quality of the paper, but she gets a standing ovation for entering the room, hooping and hollering, and that's really more the direction we're in now. Obviously, it's horrifically condescending. I don't think that Black people are so stupid that they don't notice this. It's such a farce at this point. We are not treating people fairly. Black people are not children. Gay people are not children. We need to just adopt a colorblind, fair standard for people.
Thank you, David.
Something that I think about a lot is the way that social justice sometimes relitigates the past. And, you know, I believe like that we don't really choose who our parents were. We don't choose what country we were born in or place or time. And we all make the best of where we land, you know. That's part of my religion. Where my religion comes into it is to reject this idea of original sin, or this idea that you can go back several decades and say to someone that, you know, now you have to be punished for what you did then. But the times then were completely different, and society's judgment on you then was completely different, and you didn't know what was coming years down the road. I think we need to really avoid judging people in today's times by today's standards, when they didn't have any more idea than anybody else that what they were doing was wrong way back then, you know. I think about that in the terms of pioneers that were given land here and pretty well raped the environment and never thought twice about it. Like all the natural resources were just endless. You know, are we to blame them now for our situation? And what point is there in doing that? You know? I'll stand down, but I'm all about applying time to the
appreciate
the
it.
thing.
Marie?
Oh, that's a mistake.
Okay.
I thought I was lowering my.
No, you raised it. Wesley?
Okay.
Wesley? Turn on your camera. Well,
Here we go.
Okay. Apparently, 4 out of 10 people can't deal with a $400 emergency. There's no, as far as I know, there isn't any color attached to the figure. Perhaps someone else knows if there is. So that would mean, because there's certainly, it means that, I don't know what it means exactly, except that 40% of the population, roughly, is hardly privileged by any reasonable definition. It's almost a disaster if 40% of the American population cannot deal with a $400 emergency. I don't know what you would say. I don't have any idea of how all these people got into this situation. But it suggests that there isn't very much privilege for at least 40% of the population. And it doesn't seem to have anything to do with skin color. Because, you know, if you take away the portion of the population that is distinctly some other color, I don't know where they all fall. It just seems that this is a terrible problem. And the problem is an economic one, not based necessarily on skin color.
Yeah, appreciate all the comments. Richard, are we near our time?
Yeah, we are.
Yeah. You want to do closing words?
Well,
I want to thank all the people who made comments. I realized we could have a two or three-way conversation about everything said, but there really wasn't time for that here, but you can go on and email this and whatever else.
We have a, UMIAC has a, what they call listserv. That's a, do I need to explain what that is? That's
No.
email chats. UMIAC has a listserv. And if you would like to get on, if you're not on the listserv, it's called UMIAC discussion. If you'd like to get on the listserv, if you send an email to that same, trying to find everyone here. Where's everyone? I'm trying to put something in the chat. Oh, here we go, I think. I hope this went to everybody. Yeah. I've put in the chat the email to which you write if you want to get an invitation to our third Wednesday services, but that if you use that same email and say you'd like to be included on our listserv, I can add your name to our listserv, and then you can be part of this online conversation. Alan, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Richard, the board of UUMUAC had established a policy that you needed to be a member of UUMUAC to be added or included in that listserv. So anybody who's not a member is welcome to join, and we would love to have you join and be a supporter of our mission. And then you can certainly join the listserv. But if you're not a member and don't become a member, then you're not really eligible to participate in that listserv, which is for UUMUAC members.
Yeah. Sorry, Alan is our treasurer, so he's right on top of things like this. I blew it. Yeah.
$30 a year.
Yeah. Yes. But this was free, and we're glad you're here.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming. I don't have closing words except to say thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. And this will be on YouTube. If you go to our website, umiac.org, and you scroll down, there's not only a link for the videos of the third Wednesday services, there's another link for our YouTube channel. This will be on that channel. And if you found this valuable, maybe you could share it with other people. But thank you for being here.